So hello and welcome to our 11th podcast of Tapas&Pretzels. And we have two Davids here in our podcast. One of them is David O'Neill and one of them is also David Roldan. Sorry, your name is long. And Martinez and Tim, also called the Tim and David Show. So David, I assume you are the COO of the API Context. Do you want to also add something to introduction or?
Sure, I can do. So API Context only was recently formed out of a merger between API Metrics, my company, which has been around for 8 or 9 years now, looking at API performance, and Context, who were focused on security and compliance and governance issues. And we realized that the two technologies actually are part of the same problem. And we realized that we were better off together. So as of December 29th, we are one company. So it was we are very, very fresh, barely 2 weeks old. Very excited to talk about all the things that we're doing. So
thank you, David, for your introduction. Before our meeting, there was a huge discussion actually every time if we record. We have a good discussion, so we should continue to that. So if I give you a word, for example, regulated APIs, that's a word. How would you describe it, or how can we start this conversation? Maybe David, you can, or which David wants to start?
David, please go ahead.
Okay. From my point of view, regulated APIs, are APIs that are forced or they have to meet some regulation constraints. One example, for example, is it's open banking. Open banking is a regulation that states that two kind of APIs have to be implemented: payment initiation and account aggregation. So that your open banking implementation has to offer those APIs and connect it with your backend to provide the open banking services. It's true that when banks started implementing open banking, they have Boost also another APIs initiative, which are banking APIs that are not open banking. Banking APIs are not regulated. Open banking APIs are regulated. The fact that you have to address with some regulation constraints has some implications, not only in the API development process, but also in governance. So my question to you, David, is which are, in your opinion, those constraints, or which are those special topics that should be addressed when developing and deploying an API regulated?
This is a big topic. I'll say that. I'll try and keep it focused on some of the things we observe with customers. So at API Context, we work with quite a few of the world's largest banks, and some of them have, I would say, been more enthusiastic about open APIs and open banking APIs than others. It's been a bit of a shock to their systems. I think we talked about this in the pre-session, where some of them didn't want to do it. Opening up your customer base to third parties isn't really something that bigger organizations wanted to do. But I think some see that there's huge potential for new products, new opportunities for them, in much the same way that in telecommunications, having standards for cellular telephones made a big difference to the carriers. They could actually compete with each other on pricing and packaging and what they offered, versus trying to compete on actually getting phones in hands. I think it's the illusion of giving people a choice that they can move can actually paradoxically keep people as customers longer. But I think looking at the APIs, a number of trends have emerged for us. The first one is people have become more obsessed on the open regulated banking APIs with quality. How do you stand up against your competitors? Because they are all doing the same thing, it's very easy to do like-for-like comparisons with your availability, And often the regulators ask about availability metrics and latency metrics. I think we can argue whether the regulators know what they're asking for. A lot of this was built on what happened in the United Kingdom in 2019 around the standards. But I think there's still a lot of value in people knowing who's got better APIs than others. And I think people are starting to realize it becomes a brand protection thing. If you're connected to third-party APIs and you're transferring money between different services, you're only as good as the weakest link in that chain. And what we've observed with our customers is if a customer is looking at the portal for Bank X or the app for Bank X, and they can't transfer money from Bank Y, they don't blame Bank Y or the fintech they're transferring the money through. They'll blame their bank. And that's meant that the bank CIOs in particular have got very focused on what we don't want to be. If a third-party money transfer service or a second bank are causing us problems, we want that open and public. We don't want to be getting the blame for what somebody else's problems. So we came at this initially from just a performance. Is it available? Could you prove it to a third party? How do you provide performance metrics that everybody can agree on a true perspective? But as we've evolved, we've seen that the regulators are now saying, well, are you actually returning things in the correct format? And we've seen problems with this in Australia and other jurisdictions where everyone says they're following the banking standard, but actually some people return dates in ISO format, some people return dates in a different format. And this means that people are constantly having to fix things on the APIs. And what we've come to realize is people aren't necessarily validating what they send in production. They test it. They use linting tools. They do what we think of currently as governance checks in the development process. But one hot fix later, there's been a bug, somebody fixed something, they push something into production. It doesn't work quite the same way. And that can break third-party applications. It can break connectors. And what we've heard from the large aggregators, the kind of the Plaids, the Tinks, the Trustleys, is they just live with that. That's their life. But they spend a disproportionate amount of their engineering resource just fixing things that have gone wrong in bank connectors. And that's great if you're a massive organization with huge engineering resources. But the whole point of open standards is anybody can do this and build an application to the spec, and the spec should be what drives it. And we're seeing a need for the spec to be the source of truth and people to have ways of consistently validating against those specifications and making sure that what they deliver is what they thought they were. And the final piece of that wraps up into security. There's very complex, rightly so, security requirements on these APIs. And the same thing, does it work the same way all the time? Have you accidentally opened up some security holes? If somebody came and if a third party came and asked you to prove it, essentially prove your alibi, could you? And I think a lot of companies have realized that their systems are lacking the ability to give that kind of evidence. And I think these are all parts of the same topic that we're loosely calling governance, but it's a very broad topic that touches. Everyone seems to think it's an engineering issue, and it's not. It's a business issue, and it should be led by, I think, the product teams, and it should be part of a business view that extends into engineering, and extends into delivery, extends into product. That's my sort of opening. If that's not too deep.
And one thing is, the government is introducing new standards and like open banking APIs, but there's one thing is like the companies start like being compliant with these government, and then over time the standards are changing, and then it's creating again the stress of the organization, like adapting to the new standards and being compliant again. And this is always something where product managers usually getting into trouble, like getting to understand all the fine details. What is regulated? What has to be done? What has to be delivered? Is it the date format? Is it now really regulated? Was it before? All my APIs are compliant right now. How can I check that? And this is like creates a lot of effort into the companies. And David, API context, David, what is your take on that? Have you experienced this? I mean, we are now in the time where PSD3 is about to come and FIDA is about to come. Any thoughts on this?
PSD3 is interesting because, again, they didn't have a plan on specifying APIs and specifying what those APIs are going to be. The goal of it was to build on what they did with PSD2. But what we found with PSD2 was some countries took it very seriously, some countries didn't, and it's been left up to the national regulators. And PSD3, in theory, was going to set more API standards around what you should and shouldn't do. And I think they haven't really quite done that. So I think there's room now for a PSD4 to come in another 18 months or so that will actually specify rules and regulations. And the interesting thing is the US is often last to make decisions. And amazingly, the US is now sort of stepping ahead with this, with the recent Consumer Finance Protection Bureau 1033 ruling. Americans don't come up with nice ways of calling things like PSD3, but it is actually specifying people should use APIs. The API should follow a particular technical standard. The API should have certain performance criteria. PSD3 hasn't quite gone that far, and I think that's a shame with PSD3 because it will mean that it's left to the national regulators, and the national regulators will continue to make their own choices on that versus anything that we would have expected them to do. And there's a perception, particularly from my former country in Britain, that the European Union always over-specifies and over-regulates things. And interestingly, PSD3 isn't. And it's one instance where I actually think there could have been a little bit more focus from the European Commission on this is very important for banking and capital transfer standards between European nations, and they haven't quite gone as far as I wanted to see them go. I think, David, I saw you have a conversation with somebody on LinkedIn a few months ago on this topic, where there was you were surprised that APIs weren't actually mentioned more in the regulation.
Yeah, I think that one of the worst thing of PSD3 is that it's under-regulated. I expected from PSD3 more regulation or regulation, not even more, because it states nothing. It's good that it's opening the API landscape to other services than payment initiation and account aggregation. That's great because it allows you to build a more flexible ecosystems on top of APIs. But I think that being a topic as important as financial services and regulated also, it should be addressed more, more level of detail on which kind of APIs should be exposed. Not only on the definition or the business domains you want to expose through APIs, but also trying to state some conventions to follow. I think that standardization in financial services is very important for banks and other financial institutions, not only fintechs, to boost the market and to provide really an enhanced customer experience, and also to create innovative services. But we need in this landscape some kind of solid and well-established regulation or standardization.
And also not to be focused on only the APIs. I think what's really crucial to standardize there is like the data objects itself. Like, how does a really account look like? How does a transaction look like? What is the date format of that transaction?
Accountability also is a good point there.
And the interesting thing I've seen is where some of this has been led by industry, and the industry themselves have said, "Oh, we need this because it's costing us a lot of money to integrate with each other." And if you look at some of the big aggregators, they know they have to cooperate with themselves and banks. I've been on calls with some of their compliance heads where they've suddenly realized that actually it also means that anybody can do this. And I think there has been sometimes a moment of shock. There was, hang on, so anybody could raise money and go and build something to compete with us, and the open specifications will mean they can. It's like, well, yes, but then you should be competing on quality of service and the offerings that you add around it, and not just competing on the fact that you've been able to do the work which was expensive when you did it, and then you've captured people and they can never leave. And I think this was the original ethos of the Payment Service Directive 1 and the open banking regulations in the UK, which is people couldn't even change bank accounts easily. If you had automatic payments in your bank account and you wanted to change banks, you would have to manually transfer all of those payments and make sure that everything went through. And you wouldn't be allowed to keep a record of all your financial transactions. You'd lose it all because the bank considered it was their data. And I think one of the reasons why in other countries it's being called a consumer data right, or data right in Australia, is that the data is yours, and APIs are the way that we can access this data. But I think it opens up over the next 5 years a really interesting change in the dynamic between customers, the consumers, us, and large organizations who historically have felt that we are their product. And I think APIs will give us the power to access our data and to get our data back and create new ways of monetizing data and monetizing services, but also make it more democratic for everybody to move things around and actually have choice. But that will require that the APIs actually work, and they work in a consistent way. And I think that touches back on governance, which is how do third parties agree with each other and the regulator that things are working the way they think they should. And I think that's at the crux of what people are going to need to be able to prove and need to be able to do.
Absolutely.
I think which brings us back to being compliant with the standards, how good or bad they are. I mean, in the end, you as an enterprise, you have to be compliant with certain standards, and you have to sign off the form that you are compliant. And I think API context here has some smart aspects how to help enterprises or product managers of APIs in the company to.
We lost Tim. Sorry, Tim.
Yeah.
I think I can guess where you were going, and so we're working on the ability to give people ways of pulling in data from different sources and then validate that data against standards and specifications, whether it's an open API specification, whether it's an open banking standard like FDX or Open Banking UK, and be able to validate then that of the banking identity security standard FAPI, and then have ways of monitoring that either with observed traffic, synthetic transactions, and produce data that can be shared in a sort of holistic 360-degree view of this is what the outside is seeing, this is what we're seeing inside. This tells us if we've drifted away from where we wanted to be, and provide ways for the product team effectively to take ownership of that and stop it being necessarily something that engineering do. And we're very keen that this be put in the hands of the product teams who are owning the solutions, and not be what I think has happened historically, which is engineering are told off to go and solve this problem. They solve it for themselves, but it then becomes very hard to prove to a third party that it's been solved. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Like, I think in the end, APIs I currently have seen more as a technical solution, and we are here right now in the part of government API governance, whatever that means in that context, and also like it's really driving business to be compliant. And I think we need tools or methods for business product owners of APIs, how they can get a better feeling or get a better understanding of their current APIs, how they work, are they compliant, do they have the business requirements fulfilled. And if there is something which is beneficial to those underrepresented group, I think that's something really worth to talk about.
And I think from our perspective, what we're hearing loud and clear from product owners and managers is they are concerned that they don't have full visibility of the solutions under their management. They have lots of different stakeholders asking them for things that they don't necessarily understand or know for sure that they are delivering, and they want to be able to have mechanisms for keeping an eye on the whole system and knowing before people make a complaint. And we haven't seen many situations where there have been regulatory fines. They've started in the UK with sort of regulatory slap on the wrist for banks, particularly around we mandate that you must provide this data. And we did as API Metrics, we did a check completely independently of the regulator, where we looked at data consistency, what data was being shared, Did it match the requirements of the specification? So essentially linting in production and verifying that the spec, doing schema validation checks. But we also did a quick check on data freshness. And one of the things we noticed was, in the case of one bank, they hadn't updated the data in over 1,000 days. And we knew for a fact that given what the data was for, and given we could Google and see that they had actually changed that data should have changed in the last 1,000 days, because they'd announced multiple changes to, it was, in this case, the number of branches they had. And we knew for a fact they just hadn't updated the data. And it was quite clear that nobody had, once they'd followed the regulation and said, oh, we will put out an API that provides all of our branch data. But they didn't actually ever change it or go back and check it. And it stopped being part of, once they ticked the box that they'd done it, nobody had the role to go back and check and validate that the data was being pulled from a new source or it was being changed. I think that's the kind of thing that it's closing that loop on whose job is it to do that. And engineering would argue it's not their job. Somebody needs to tell them if they need to change the API or pull from a new data source. But no product manager knows to go and read, in some cases, 2009 JSON file and check that all of the items are correct. And this is where you need tools that will actually validate that you've got the right number of things and that will do the checks. And that's what we're trying to bring to the table with API context, to really give people the ability to do this automatically through rules on what you're putting out in public. And if somebody asks you to prove on the 23rd of December 2023 that you were compliant, you can actually go back and check and say, yes, here is our proof. And at the moment, I think most organizations would be hard pressed to do something like that they would go, well, it looks good now. I'm sure it was fine. And that's not how we should do things. And it's certainly not how we should do things around APIs, because sooner or later, you're going to find that actually on that day you were leaking PII or something else had gone wrong. And I think this ties into another part of conformance and governance. When people talk about API security, and we touched on this in the preamble, people think about hackers hacking APIs. And what we hear from CISOs is they're actually less worried about hackers hacking APIs. The idea of a hack is very rarely an instantaneous thing that happens. What they find is the API hasn't been hacked. An exploit has been found in the API that can just be exploited. If you look at some of the big high-level news stories, the T-Mobile incident, the Australian incident, they were not hacks. They were just the API did what it was designed to do. And if you ask for everybody's records, it gave them to you. But they hadn't been checking to see whether you could do that or not. What we see with API security is like, well, if we see someone trying to get into your API, we can stop them and we can prevent attacks. But that doesn't help you if the API was designed, or if the API design slipped and allowed somebody just to make a request for all records, and the records happen to include date of birth, personal identifying information, other things that shouldn't be there. But we know, because we've explored this ourselves at API Context, app developers will send more information in certain API calls than they need to, because it's easier to use the data if you get it all in one block in the app than it is necessarily to make multiple requests for the data in a secure way. And these are things that don't, on the face of it, look like security problems, but they actually are. But they are governance problems of, hang on, no, we should enforce how we ask for PII and make sure that people are asking for it in the right way, rather than just if somebody asks for a personal record for an individual, giving them everything to identify that individual, so that somebody who did have access to keys or some other way of accessing the API can do something nefarious with it. And I think these are all parts of some people call it, it's security over there, but it's governance over here, it's compliance in this group. And it's really pulling these things together under what we probably need a new name for this, because I think governance is just way too bigger title.
The question that was,
so please send your ideas on postcards or emails to me.
Yeah. Will do.
Yeah, it's just like one thing that always jumps to my mind when I hear the people not taking care on the APIs. I think usually it's some sort of like business focus. And if I don't see a value in my APIs, then it's just an overhead. I have to be compliant somehow with a minimal effort, and there's no reason for me to handle it as a product, because a product usually has a life cycle, and it's like iterates often to product stages and matures over time. But if I only want to be compliant with a minimal effort as much as possible, then it's not taking any improvements during that time, and that's something I don't know, David, if you have take the same observations, or what is your take on that?
I think that comes down to, it's a good point, Tim, and we saw that initially in regulated sectors, and then the regulators started saying, well, hang on, we want to see this proved. And it's driven a lot more focus in banks of, hang on, well, how do we actually get on top of these things? And I think it started with performance. The simple question of, is it up and is it working reliably and consistently? And now what we're seeing from our customers is, okay, so we think we've got performance under control, but what are we missing? What are the things that one day are going to wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm going to have a very bad day? And that's, I think, there's an evolution happening inside organizations of we spent a long time. Remember, we're in an industry that's only really a decade old. That's about how long's passed since Jeff Bezos's notorious memo. We're now at the point where people can deliver consistently performing APIs, give or take. Not everybody does. But now they're starting to look at, well, hang on, are the business, do they meet the business needs, and can we prove that they meet the business needs? And I think we're in a second wave of maturity for the industry, which is now it's stopped being something engineering focus on and starting to be something that the C-suite is actually getting interested in. Whether it's something that's driving additional revenue, or whether it's something that's essential for delivery of the business. And I think we touched on API monetization, which is a whole separate topic in our pre-game talk. But I think one of the questions, and I'm pretty sure David wrote something on this on a blog post, but is monetization, are you monetizing your APIs? Are you using APIs to monetize your business? And I think it's something that there's been a lot of confusion about. Initially, it was like, well, why should we build APIs? Will they make us any money? And I think we're now entering, the reality of 2024 is, if you don't have APIs, then your business will not be here in a year's time or 2 years' time. People will not want to work with you, and they will not want to integrate with you. So it doesn't matter whether you monetize your APIs or not, because your business is about those APIs and how you deliver. And if you're delivering APIs, then you need to know how well they work, how fast they are they reliable? Are you delivering what you say you are? And could you prove it to your customers? Because at the end of the day, you will have to meet service level objectives, and those objectives will include data quality, consistency, security, and other factors. And I think we're now reaching a point in the maturity cycle where that's going to matter.
Yeah, and the best way to meet those requirements you just already mentioned is API governance once again.
Yes. And having the tooling in place to make it, to stop it being, it can't be something that's seen to be something for engineers to look at occasionally, or to just say, yeah, it's fine. We saw that in performance. We saw that with performance monitoring. Oh, we'll put that into DevOps. DevOps will tell us. And then we've had customers come to us, well, we've had big outages and DevOps didn't notice them, or they didn't tell us. And it has to be something that's owned by, these are business scale problems that need to be about the business. And I think that's the governance of APIs is a business problem. It's not a technical problem.
A mix of both from my point of view, but we can leave this interesting topic to another talk.
Yes. Who owns APIs is going to be a whole other world of...
What does API governance mean? I mean, the context is quite crucial for that, because governance is a really wide term.
Mm-hmm.
And it encompasses so much. It does encompass performance. It encompasses compliance. It encompasses conformance. It does encompass security. But it's also something, I think, if you had these conversations at events like API Days a year ago, you'd get a lot of engineering heads who just did, it's like the big stick they didn't want anybody to talk about. They didn't want conversations about governance because it was seen as, oh God, not governance again. No, please. And now we're saying, well, actually, they should embrace it. It's very important to the delivery of the system. And yeah, I think we at API Context want to stop it being a dirty word. We want it to be something that goes hand in hand with using Postman or Checkly for your testing, that you should have something that does the same for governance, and it's seamless. Everybody has a dashboard they can go and look at that tells them whether you're meeting what you expect to or not. And that should be intuitive. It should be simple to use and straightforward, and give you the information that directed at you for your audience. And you shouldn't have to dig around to find it.
Okay, so I would say the magic words of today are governance and APIs, and they're also maybe the gateway to heaven, and also API context. So
the context in which you use your APIs, yes.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say thank you very much that you were here. It was really interesting for all of us, and also really interesting topics. So I would say we will see us for the next podcast, and have a nice evening or
morning, day.
Morning. Of course,
yes.
Of course. So
thank you, and so thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I would love to come back at some point in the future and finish this conversation, David.
Of course.
Yeah. You're at home, David.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.